We don't have much time. The doctor's words cut through the sterile air of St. Gabriel Children's Hospital like a sharp alarm, freezing Emily Carter in place as she clutched her 8-month-old son, Noah, against her chest, the tiny body trembling in her arms, and the beeping monitors echoing every shallow breath, every flutter of his fragile heartbeat, while the soft hum of the hospital lights above seemed to blur with the pounding of her own pulse, and she could feel the weight of the room pressing down as every second ticked closer to the impossible, her fingers curling around the soft blanket wrapped around him, wishing desperately she could turn back time, wishing she could conjure the thousands of dollars required for the emergency procedure, knowing she had already sold her car, every piece of jewelry, and emptied her savings account just to get him this far, yet still falling short. The sterile scent of antiseptic mingling with the faint hint of baby lotion as she looked up. At the flurry of nurses moving purposefully, papers rustling, a will squeaking down the hall, and the distant sound of elevators pinging up and down, each sound hammering into her ears with the urgency of a drumbeat that refused to relent, her mind spinning with memories of the last year, sleepless nights at the restaurant, where she worked 2 back-to-back shifts just to cover rent and pediatric therapy appointments, her eyes tracing every detail of Noah's tiny face, the soft curve of his cheek, the roundness of his little hands curled into fists, and she felt the full force of fear she had tried to suppress now hitting her like a tidal wave. While outside the window, the city skyline glimmered in the late afternoon light, oblivious to the life-or-death struggle unfolding within the walls of the hospital, and Emily's throat tightened as she whispered softly to him, "Hold on, my love, hold on." Her voice barely audible over the hurried footsteps, the rustle of gowns, and the low murmur of the medical team coordinating urgently, the clock above the nurse's station ticking down every minute as though mocking her helplessness. And in that moment, a figure in a tailored navy suit appeared at the end of the hallway, his presence calm, yet commanding. Ethan Whitmore, a billionaire known for his precision and composure, his sharp gray eyes taking in the scene without a word, yet somehow absorbing the desperation, the fear, the helplessness radiating off a young mother clinging to her child, his polished shoes silent on the linoleum floor, the soft click of his watch echoing like a metronome against the otherwise chaotic rhythm. And though he had come to the hospital for unrelated business, something in the way Noah's tiny fingers grasped Emily's thumb, the fragile life in need of immediate care, tugged at a memory long buried, a time when he himself had faced loss he never fully reconciled with. And the air between them seemed to thrum with unspoken recognition as the doctor glanced at Emily, then at Ethan, silently calculating the likelihood of securing rapid approval for the surgery, while the young mother's chest heaved with anxiety and the child's quiet whimpers barely audible, each breath shallow, each eyelash brushing against her cheek like a fragile promise of survival. And in that split instant, Emily's eyes locked with Ethan's, sensing a calm determination behind his measured expression, the kind that could bend policies, expedite paperwork, and bridge worlds between desperation and possibility. While outside, the soft glow of city lights began to shimmer through the tall hospital windows, casting long shadows down the polished floors. And in that fleeting moment, hope, raw and uncertain, edged its way into Emily's heart as she felt the presence of someone who might turn the tide, someone who might stand between her son and the cruel limitations of circumstance, breathing steady, shoulders squared, eyes fixed on the child, as though silently promising that what needed to be done would be done, all while the clock continued its relentless countdown and the monitors ticked in rhythm with her fraying nerves, each second a heartbeat of suspense, each sound a reminder of how close they were to the edge of the unknown, the corridor alive with the hum of movement and quiet authority, the weight of countless decisions pressing down. Yet, in that very tension, a spark of possibility ignited, a faint thread linking desperation to intervention, fear to action, and Emily, clutching Noah, allowed herself the briefest flicker of belief that maybe, just maybe, the impossible could become reality in the hands of someone willing to act with both resolve and compassion. The moment Ethan Whitmore disappeared around the corner with a hospital administrator, the fragile spark of hope Emily had felt began to flicker under the weight of reality. Hope was dangerous. Hope had disappointed her before. She lowered herself into a hard plastic chair outside the pediatric cardiac unit and carefully adjusted Noah's blanket, brushing a strand of blonde hair from his forehead as his tiny chest rose and fell beneath a web of monitoring wires. Around her, life continued as if nothing extraordinary was happening. Phones rang behind reception desks. Elevators opened and closed with soft chimes. Visitors carried coffee cups and flowers through the hallways. Yet for Emily, the entire world had narrowed to the rhythm of her son's breathing. She reached into her purse and stared at the contents. A worn wallet, 2 receipts, a nearly empty bottle of hand sanitizer, $73.41. That was all she had left after months of specialist visits, medications, tests, and emergency consultations. $73.41 standing between her and a hospital bill that looked more like the budget of a small business. Her throat tightened as she remembered the long road that had brought her here. Less than a year ago, she had been carrying Noah through the narrow aisles of a small apartment while memorizing restaurant menus for extra shifts. During the day, she cared for him. At night, she balanced trays and smiled through exhaustion, while wealthy customers discussed stock portfolios and vacation homes worth more than she would earn in several lifetimes. Many evenings her feet hurt so badly she could barely walk to her car. Yet every dollar had a purpose. Formula, rent, doctor visits, therapy appointments, diapers. The numbers never stopped growing. The money never stretched far enough. Then came the diagnosis. The specialist's voice had been calm and professional, but the words had shattered her future into pieces. A rare congenital condition, correctable with surgery, critical if untreated. Since that day, every hour of her life had become a race against time. Emily closed her eyes and remembered the countless nights she had sat at her kitchen table after Noah fell asleep, searching for financial assistance programs, filling out applications, sending emails, and making phone calls that often ended with polite apologies and long waiting lists. She had learned that desperation had its own language. It sounded like hold music. It sounded like voicemail recordings. It sounded like promises that never arrived. A sudden cough from Noah pulled her back to the present. Instantly, she leaned forward, placing her hand gently on his tiny arm. His eyes opened briefly. Blue eyes, bright despite the exhaustion. He looked at her and managed the faintest smile. Emily felt her heart break and heal at the same time. "I am right here," she whispered. "I am not going anywhere." Across the hall, a television mounted near the waiting area flashed a business news segment. Ethan Whitmore's face appeared on the screen. The anchor spoke about billion-dollar acquisitions, investment strategies, and corporate expansion. Emily barely paid attention. To her, he was just another wealthy executive living in a different universe. She had no reason to believe that someone like him would ever notice someone like her. Yet several floors above, Ethan stood silently in a private conference room overlooking the city skyline. The folder containing Noah's medical records rested unopened in front of him. His gaze lingered on the photograph clipped to the file. A small child smiling into the camera. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he slowly lowered himself into a chair, staring at the picture as memories he had spent years trying to bury began to surface once again. Memories that refused to stay in the past. The photograph remained on the table long after everyone else had left the conference room. Ethan Whitmore stared at it while the city stretched beyond the glass walls behind him. Millions of lights beginning to glow against the darkening Chicago skyline. For years, people had described him with the same words. Ruthless, brilliant, untouchable. Financial magazines praised his instincts. Business networks analyzed his decisions. Competitors feared him. Investors trusted him. Yet none of those people knew what happened after the cameras disappeared. None of them knew why he sometimes stayed alone in his office long after midnight. None of them knew why certain dates never appeared on his calendar. Ethan picked up the photograph again. Noah's smile was simple and innocent, the kind of smile that existed before life taught people about fear and disappointment. His fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the paper. Across town, entire industries moved because of decisions he made. Billion-dollar projects waited for his approval. Thousands of employees depended on his leadership. But at that moment, none of it seemed important. His thoughts drifted backward through time. 15 years earlier, he had not been the man the world knew today. He had been younger, less guarded, more hopeful. Back then, success had not yet built walls around his life. There had been laughter in his home, weekend trips, family photographs covering shelves and tables, dreams that extended far beyond quarterly earnings reports and stock prices. Then one terrible season changed everything. Loss entered his life quietly and left behind a silence that never completely disappeared. Since then, Ethan had mastered the art of moving forward without looking back. He buried himself in work. He expanded companies, acquired competitors, built an empire. The world called it ambition. In reality, it was survival. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. The hospital administrator stepped into the room, carrying a folder. "Mr. Whitmore, I apologize for disturbing you." Ethan looked up. "What is it?" The administrator hesitated. "The child downstairs." The financial department reviewed the account. Ethan already knew what came next. Hospitals had procedures. Procedures had requirements. Requirements had numbers attached to them. "How much?" he asked quietly. The administrator opened the folder. "The estimated cost exceeds $180,000. The mother does not qualify for immediate approval under several assistance programs. There are waiting periods." Waiting periods. The words hung in the air like a cold draft. Ethan looked toward the window. Somewhere below, Emily was still sitting beside her son, counting minutes she could not afford to lose. The administrator continued speaking about policies, approvals, documentation, and financial responsibility, but Ethan barely heard him. Another memory surfaced. Another hospital. Another hallway. Another family praying for time. His jaw tightened. "How long before the procedure becomes critical?" he asked. "The surgical team believes the sooner the better. Every hour matters. Every hour matters." The sentence echoed through his mind. Downstairs, Emily had fallen asleep for only a moment in the waiting chair. Exhaustion finally catching up with her. Her head rested against the wall, while Noah slept quietly beside her. The overhead lights cast soft shadows across her tired face. She looked younger while she slept, more vulnerable. The nurse at the station watched her for a moment and gently lowered the volume on a nearby television. Nobody had the heart to wake her. Meanwhile, Ethan rose from his chair and walked toward the conference room window. Traffic flowed below like streams of red and white light. Thousands of strangers moving through ordinary evenings, unaware that a decision was approaching that would alter several lives forever. Behind him, the folder remained open on the table. Noah's medical records, cost estimates, approval requirements, signatures waiting for someone willing to accept responsibility. Ethan stared into the darkness outside and felt something he had not allowed himself to feel in years. Not obligation, not charity, something deeper, something personal. And for the first time since seeing the child in the hallway, he stopped asking what it would cost and started asking what would happen if nobody stepped forward. Emily stirred as a soft knock on the door signaled the nurse's approach, her eyes flickering open to the pale fluorescent lights overhead. The faint hum of ventilation filling the silent hospital corridor, and she adjusted Noah in her arms as he yawned and stretched tiny limbs with delicate precision, his blue eyes opening to meet hers, trust and dependence clear in their gaze, while her heart thumped against her chest with a mixture of exhaustion and unspoken hope, every thought occupied by what could happen in the next few minutes. Every breath synchronized with the gentle rise and fall of her son's chest, the waiting chairs around her still empty except for the occasional passing staff member, their footsteps muted by the soft padding of shoes on polished linoleum. And as Emily watched, she remembered the countless nights she had sat at her small apartment, stacking bills and planning shifts, calculating every expense while trying to keep hope alive for a life where Noah could grow healthy and safe. And now here she was, the air heavy with anticipation, her palms slightly damp as she rubbed them together, a reflexive motion to steady the storm within, when a quiet voice called from the end of the hall, drawing her gaze upward where Ethan Whitmore appeared, the man in the tailored navy suit moving with composed determination, the hospital identification badge reflecting the overhead light, and his eyes, gray and sharp, fixed on the tiny figure she held, a flicker of something human breaking through the professional detachment he always maintained, while he approached with measured steps, every movement deliberate and calm, contrasting with the chaos of emotion swirling around Emily. And when he reached the side of the chair, he paused, silently observing the bond between mother and child, The way Emily's fingers lingered protectively along Noah's arm, the gentle tilt of her head, the soft rhythm of whispered reassurances, and in that pause, he sensed the urgency, the fragility, the weight of every second slipping by, as though the corridor itself held its breath, waiting for a decision to be made, the air thick with possibility and unspoken questions. Emily's chest tightening as she realized someone had finally seen her struggle, someone whose presence alone suggested that solutions beyond her reach might now be within grasp. And Ethan lifted the folder in his hands, the paperwork for the emergency procedure, his fingers brushing against the thick stack of forms, yet his expression betrayed nothing of doubt or hesitation. Only a quiet resolve that made Emily's pulse spike with a mix of fear and cautious optimism, while the distant sound of an elevator bell echoed faintly down the hall, a reminder that time was moving relentlessly forward, and she caught her breath, the weight of exhaustion settling into her shoulders as Ethan spoke softly, just enough to be heard. "We can make this happen." And though the words were simple, they carried the magnitude of promise, and Emily felt a tremor of relief course through her, the tension in her shoulders easing fractionally, while Noah stirred again, a tiny hand reaching instinctively toward Ethan, connecting the two in a silent acknowledgement of presence and care. And in that instant, the corridor transformed from a place of sterile waiting into a space where hope and action met, the soft hum of hospital life continuing around them. Yet for Emily and Ethan, the world had narrowed to the small circle of mother, child, and the man willing to bridge the gap between despair and possibility, every movement deliberate, every glance weighted with meaning, as they prepared to move forward into the moments that would decide the course of a young life, each heartbeat echoing like a drum of anticipation, the fragile trust between mother and son radiating outward, intersecting with the quiet determination of the man who had chosen to act, and the hall, bathed in soft light, seemed to pulse with the collective energy of what was about to unfold, the minutes stretching, yet charged with a sense that something extraordinary was imminent, the corridor itself holding the breath of everyone waiting, every step echoing as Emily and Ethan prepared for the first move that could alter everything for Noah, her small hands gripping the blanket a little tighter, his gentle stirring reinforcing the importance of the next actions. And in that quiet but potent moment, both mother and stranger understood the stakes, the responsibility, and the fragile promise of life hanging delicately in the balance. The optimism that had briefly settled over the hallway did not last long. Hope, Emily had learned, was rarely allowed to arrive without another test. Less than 20 minutes after Ethan's quiet promise, a pediatric surgeon entered carrying a tablet and a stack of forms. His expression was professional, but the concern in his eyes was impossible to miss. He greeted Emily gently before reviewing Noah's latest scans with members of the medical team gathered nearby. Emily could not understand every medical term, but she understood enough. Time was running out. The surgeon explained that Noah's condition remained treatable, yet every delay increased the risks. The procedure needed to happen as soon as possible. Emily listened while holding her son closer, her fingers trembling slightly beneath the blanket. Then came the conversation she had feared from the very beginning. A financial coordinator arrived carrying additional documents. She spoke kindly. She spoke respectfully. But policies were policies. Before the operating room could be reserved and the surgical team fully mobilized, authorization still had to be completed. Insurance reviews, liability forms, financial guarantees, signatures. Emily felt her stomach sink. It was as though the hospital existed in two worlds at once. In one world, doctors fought to save lives. In the other, paperwork determined how quickly that fight could begin. The coordinator explained every detail with practiced patience, but Emily barely heard her. The numbers on the page blurred together. She looked down at Noah and felt tears threaten to return. She had already exhausted every option she knew. Every credit card had reached its limit. Every application remained pending. Every favor had already been asked. Across the room, Ethan remained silent as he watched the exchange unfold. The coordinator eventually placed the forms on a nearby counter and stepped away to answer a call. The hallway grew quiet. Only the distant sounds of hospital life remained. Wheels rolling across polished floors. Elevator chimes. Quiet conversations behind closed doors. Emily lowered her head and closed her eyes for a moment. She was exhausted. Not merely tired, but exhausted in the way only a parent could be after months of carrying fear every waking hour. She had spent nearly a year pretending to be strong, pretending that everything would somehow work out, pretending that determination alone could overcome circumstances. Now, sitting beneath the bright hospital lights, she finally felt the weight of everything pressing down at once. Ethan noticed. For the first time, he saw not just a worried mother, but a person who had been fighting a battle long before she entered this hospital. A woman who had refused to quit despite impossible odds. His eyes drifted toward Noah again. The child had fallen asleep peacefully, unaware of the conversations surrounding him, unaware of deadlines, approvals, and financial obstacles, unaware that adults were debating whether enough boxes had been checked to allow doctors to help him. Ethan felt something shift inside him. The memory that had haunted him for years no longer sat quietly in the background. It stood directly in front of him, clear, unavoidable. The hospital hallway around him seemed to fade. The sound softened. The movement blurred. All he could see was a mother trying not to break and a child depending on strangers to make the right decision. Several members of the staff continued reviewing schedules and availability reports nearby. One nurse glanced at the clock mounted above the station. Another updated patient records. Life moved forward minute by minute. Yet Ethan understood something none of them could measure. Every delay carried a cost beyond numbers. Every minute mattered. He slowly stepped toward the counter where the authorization documents rested untouched. The papers lay neatly stacked beneath the bright overhead lights. Waiting. Silent. Important. The next few moments would determine everything. For several long seconds, nobody moved. The documents remained on the counter beneath the bright hospital lights, and the entire hallway seemed suspended between uncertainty and action. Ethan reached for the stack of papers and slowly turned the first page. The financial coordinator looked up from across the station, confused at first, then concerned as she realized what he was doing. Emily followed his movement with tired eyes, unsure whether she was witnessing another administrative review or the beginning of yet another obstacle. Her heart pounded so loudly she could hear it over the distant sounds of rolling carts and elevator chimes. Ethan read each page carefully, not because he needed to. He had signed contracts worth billions of dollars throughout his career. Entire companies had changed ownership with a signature from his hand. Yet these pages felt different. These papers carried the weight of a single life. Noah stirred softly in his sleep as though sensing the tension surrounding him. His tiny fingers remained curled around the edge of the blanket, while Emily held him close. The financial coordinator stepped forward cautiously. "Mr. Whitmore, these forms involve significant responsibility." Ethan looked up. His expression remained calm. "I understand. The hospital requires a guarantor willing to assume full financial liability. I understand. The estimated cost may increase depending on complications and recovery needs." Ethan nodded once. "I understand." The coordinator hesitated. People often talked about helping. Far fewer committed when real responsibility appeared. Yet there was no hesitation in Ethan's eyes. No negotiation. No request for exceptions. No concern about the number attached to the forms. He picked up the pen resting beside the paperwork. Emily watched in silence. She felt as though she had forgotten how to breathe. Every difficult conversation from the past year rushed through her mind at once. Every rejection letter. Every declined application. Every polite apology from organizations unable to help. She had become so accustomed to hearing no that she no longer knew how to prepare herself for the possibility of yes. The pen moved across the page. One signature, then another, then another. The sound was almost inaudible, yet to Emily it felt louder than thunder. When Ethan finished, he closed the folder and handed it back to the coordinator. The woman stared at the completed documents for a moment before looking at him. "Again, everything is covered?" she asked quietly. Ethan's answer came without drama. "Everything." A silence settled over the hallway. Several nurses nearby exchanged glances. One doctor paused mid-conversation. Nobody expected a moment like this. Not because of the money. Because of the simplicity. There had been no speech. No announcement. No audience. Just a decision. Emily felt tears fill her eyes before she could stop them. She immediately looked down, embarrassed by the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. For months, she had fought to stay strong. Now the wall she had built around herself was beginning to crack. "Why?" she whispered. The question escaped before she could stop it. Ethan looked at Noah first before meeting her eyes. For a brief moment, something passed across his face. Not pride, not satisfaction. Something far heavier. Something older. "Because waiting is not always an option," he said quietly. Before Emily could ask another question, the surgical team arrived. The atmosphere changed instantly. Doctors reviewed charts. Nurses prepared equipment. Coordinators updated schedules. The machine of the hospital suddenly sprang into motion. What had been delayed was delayed no longer. One of the surgeons approached Emily with a reassuring smile. "We are ready." The words hit her with overwhelming force. Ready. After months of fear. After countless sleepless nights. After every setback and every impossible bill. They were finally ready. Emily kissed Noah gently on the forehead as nurses carefully prepared to move him toward the operating suite. Her hands trembled as she adjusted his blanket one final time. Ethan stood nearby, watching quietly as the small procession began moving down the corridor. The bright hallway stretched ahead beneath rows of lights, and for the first time that entire night, hope no longer felt fragile. It felt real. The moment Noah was wheeled into the operating suite, Emily felt a strange mixture of relief and lingering fear settle over her like a weight she could not put down. She followed closely behind, her hand brushing the soft blanket around her son as if the touch could transfer her courage to him. The bright lights of the operating room reflected off stainless steel surfaces, a clinical glow that made the space feel both intimidating and safe. Nurses moved efficiently, speaking in calm, precise tones that contrasted with the rapid beating of Emily's heart. Monitors beeped steadily, each sound a small reassurance that Noah's fragile body was being watched by skilled hands. Ethan Whitmore remained at her side, silent but present, his presence somehow anchoring the whirlwind of emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. The memories that haunted him had grown sharper in these moments, the echoes of past loss reminding him why every decision mattered. The anesthesiologist approached, speaking gently to both mother and child, explaining each step with patience. Emily listened, nodding, though her thoughts wandered between the present and every moment that had led them here. She had carried Noah through sleepless nights, juggling shifts, bills, and therapy appointments, each day testing her resolve and determination. Now, the culmination of that effort had brought them to a moment where hope was tangible yet still delicate, a fragile thread that could not be snapped. Ethan adjusted his tie slightly and placed a hand lightly on the back of the chair beside Emily, a silent gesture of support, a recognition that while he could not replace months of struggle, he could ensure that the necessary steps to protect life were taken. The surgeons conferred briefly, sharing observations, planning the sequence of procedures with meticulous attention. The air seemed to vibrate with the intensity of preparation, each movement deliberate, each instruction precise. Emily's breath came in shallow waves, her eyes never leaving Noah as he was prepared for anesthesia, the tiny form swaddled and calm under the careful guidance of the staff. Time felt suspended, the outside world reduced to distant murmurs and the faint hum of ventilation systems. Ethan's gaze remained focused, not on the paperwork he had signed, but on the human consequence of every decision, every signature, every policy. He had built empires, moved markets, and commanded attention, yet here, in this quiet, fluorescent-lit room, he was reminded that the most meaningful acts of power were often measured not in dollars or deals, but in the preservation of life and the compassion shown in moments of urgency. Emily felt a small tremor pass through her as the anesthesiologist signaled that Noah was ready, and she leaned down, pressing her cheek gently against his tiny head, whispering words of love and reassurance that seemed almost sacred in the quiet hum of the operating room. Ethan remained still, observing the tender interaction, his own memories stirring of moments lost and lessons learned, the depth of human fragility pressing upon him as he silently vowed that every necessary action would be taken to ensure this child's safety. The nurses guided Emily to a seat where she could watch as much as allowed, her fingers intertwined with the edge of the blanket, the room filled with controlled activity, the rhythm of measured motion and whispered communication creating a delicate symphony of care. Each person in the suite knew their role, their responsibility, and the magnitude of the task at hand. And within that precise orchestration, Emily felt the first true glimmer of hope she had experienced since entering the hospital. The monitors were set, the surgical lights focused. Noah's tiny chest rose and fell with gentle regularity, and Emily's heart, heavy for so long, found a steadying beat. Ethan, silent and composed, understood that his intervention had created this moment, that his decision to act without hesitation had bridged the gap between life and the threat of loss. And as the surgeons began their work, the atmosphere, though tense, carried an undercurrent of promise, a quiet acknowledgement that through focus, skill, and the convergence of courage and compassion, there was a chance for everything to turn toward life. And in that suspended moment, both mother and child existed at the nexus of fear and hope, their fate entrusted to hands capable, hearts committed, and the invisible thread of human resolve that bound them together in anticipation of a brighter outcome. Hours passed one slow minute at a time. The operating room doors remained closed, and the digital clock mounted above. The waiting area seemed determined to move as slowly as possible. Emily sat with her hands clasped tightly together, her eyes fixed on the hallway ahead, replaying every moment of Noah's short life in her mind. His first smile, the way he laughed whenever she sang to him after work, the tiny hand that always reached for hers whenever he felt uncertain. Around her, the hospital continued its quiet rhythm. Nurses changed shifts. Visitors came and went. Coffee cups were replaced. Conversations rose and faded. Yet for Emily, time existed only between the moment those doors had closed and the moment they would open again. Across from her, Ethan Whitmore remained seated in silence. Several times his phone vibrated with incoming calls. Board members, executives, advisors. Opportunities worth millions of dollars waited for his attention. One after another, he silenced them. For perhaps the first time in years, none of those matters felt urgent. The only update he wanted was the one still hidden behind the operating room doors. A nurse eventually approached carrying 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to Emily with a gentle smile. "You should try to drink something." Emily accepted it gratefully, though her hands trembled slightly. "Thank you." The nurse hesitated before speaking again. "Your son has an incredible team in there." Emily nodded. She wanted to believe it. She truly did. Yet fear has a way of whispering even when hope is speaking louder. Another hour passed. Then another. The city outside the hospital windows had transformed completely. The final traces of daylight disappeared, replaced by thousands of lights stretching across the skyline like stars scattered beneath the clouds. The reflection of those lights shimmered against the glass, casting a soft glow across the waiting area. Ethan found himself staring at the view while memories continued surfacing. Memories he had spent years burying beneath work, responsibility, and success. The pain was not as sharp as it once had been, but it remained. Certain losses never completely leave. They simply become quieter companions. A little after midnight, movement finally stirred beyond the operating room doors. "Hey!" Nurse emerged first. Then another. Emily immediately stood. Her coffee cup slipped from her hand and landed softly on the floor, forgotten before it even stopped rolling. Her heart raced. Every instinct told her this was the moment. The doors opened wider. The lead surgeon stepped into the hallway. His surgical cap remained in place. Exhaustion lined his face. For a fraction of a second, nobody spoke. The silence felt endless. Emily's chest tightened so fiercely she could barely breathe. Then the surgeon smiled. It was not a dramatic smile. It was small, genuine, human, and it changed everything. "The procedure was successful," he said. The words seemed to echo through the hallway. Successful. Emily covered her mouth with both hands as tears immediately filled her eyes. Her knees nearly gave way beneath her. Months of fear, exhaustion, uncertainty, and heartbreak crashed into one overwhelming wave of relief. She cried openly now, no longer trying to be strong, no longer trying to hold everything together. For the first time in what felt like forever, she could finally let herself breathe. The surgeon continued explaining details about recovery and monitoring, but Emily only caught fragments. Successful, stable, recovering. Those were the only words that mattered. Nearby, Ethan closed his eyes briefly. A quiet breath escaped him. No celebration, no speech, just relief. deep and genuine. The kind that reaches places inside a person that success and wealth never can. A few minutes later, a nurse led Emily toward the pediatric recovery unit. Through a large observation window, she finally saw Noah again. Tiny, sleeping, surrounded by careful monitoring equipment. Yet alive, safe, still here. Emily pressed a hand gently against the glass. Tears streamed down her face. Behind her, Ethan remained in the hallway, watching from a respectful distance. The bright hospital lights reflected softly across the polished floor as mother and child were finally given something they had been fighting for all along. Not certainty, not perfection, simply another chance at tomorrow. 1 year later, the sound that filled Lincoln Park on a bright spring afternoon was not the steady beeping of hospital monitors or the quiet footsteps of nurses moving through long hallways. It was laughter, pure, joyful laughter. Noah Carter raced across a patch of green grass with the determination only a young child could possess, his tiny sneakers pounding against the ground as sunlight spilled across the park and a cool breeze carried the scent of fresh flowers through the air. Emily sat on a nearby bench watching him, hardly able to believe how much life had changed. There were no hospital bracelets on his wrist now, no wires, no emergency consultations, no nights spent staring at a clock while praying for one more chance. The little boy who had once depended on an entire team of specialists simply to reach tomorrow was now chasing bubbles through the afternoon sunshine. Every laugh felt like a miracle. Every step felt like a gift. Emily smiled as Noah turned and waved excitedly before running back toward a group of children near the playground. The simple moment brought tears to her eyes. Not tears of fear this time. Tears of gratitude. The previous year had transformed her life in ways she never imagined. Shortly after Noah's recovery, she had received an unexpected invitation. A scholarship funded through the Whitmore Foundation offered her the opportunity to complete a nursing degree. At first, she thought there had been some mistake. Opportunities like that did not happen to people like her. Yet the letter was real. The support was real. And for the first time in years, she was able to build a future instead of merely surviving the present. The long restaurant shifts gradually gave way to classes, clinical training, and late nights studying textbooks, while Noah slept peacefully nearby. It was not easy. Nothing worthwhile ever was. But she approached every challenge with the same determination that had carried her through the darkest chapter of her life. Across the city, Ethan Whitmore stood inside the glass walls of his office overlooking the Chicago skyline. The company continued to grow. Investments expanded. Headlines celebrated new achievements. Yet something had changed inside him as well. For years, he had measured success through numbers, acquisitions, and market performance. Now he found himself paying closer attention to different outcomes. Children's hospitals, scholarship programs, family assistance initiatives, quiet opportunities to help people facing impossible situations. His assistant entered carrying a folder. The annual foundation report is ready. Ethan nodded and accepted it. As he flipped through the pages, one photograph immediately caught his attention. A picture of Emily standing proudly beside Noah at a community health event. Both were smiling. Both looked genuinely happy. Ethan paused for a moment. The image reminded him that sometimes the most important decisions never appear on financial statements. They never make business news. They never affect stock prices. Yet they leave a far greater impact. Later that afternoon, Ethan arrived quietly at the park. There were no cameras, no reporters, no public announcement. He simply walked along the path until he spotted Emily sitting beneath a large oak tree while Noah played nearby. Emily looked up and immediately recognized him. She stood and smiled warmly. There were no dramatic speeches between them, no grand expressions of gratitude. Some moments are too meaningful for that. Instead, they simply watched Noah run across the grass. Healthy, strong, full of life. After a few moments, Noah ran toward them carrying a bright red kite. "Look what I made," he said proudly. Ethan knelt beside him and examined the kite carefully. "That is impressive," he said with a smile. Noah beamed. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the park as families gathered nearby, and children continued to play. Life moved forward exactly as it should. Ethan watched Noah disappear into another game with friends and felt a quiet sense of peace settle over him. Not because he had solved every problem, not because he had erased every regret, but because one decision made at the right moment had changed the direction of a life. Perhaps several lives. Emily looked toward her son and then back at Ethan. You gave him a future, she said softly. Ethan shook his head. His eyes remained on the little boy running beneath the golden afternoon light. No, he replied. He already had a future. He just needed the chance to reach it. And as Noah's laughter echoed across the park, it became clear that true power was never about wealth, influence, or status. It was about recognizing a moment when another human being needed help and choosing not to look away.